This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. This is Roberto Suarez, the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers. Thank you very much for joining us in this video conference. We are expecting more or less 60, 70 participants who have registered. It's not the first one of this serial of video conference video exchange that we have launched since the COVID-19 started. But this is an exchange which we were looking forward since already more than 10, 15 days. We are in a situation of emergency. It's a situation related to a health emergency, but which has important social and economic consequences. We are working intensively as business organization and as business to anticipate and to mitigate the effects of these emergencies. But at the same time, we are trying to adapt. We are trying to look at innovative solutions which assure business continuity. And of course, telework is at the hardcore of many of our discussions. Well, telework policies are not always easy. And I would say that not all organizations, not all business have been prepared. Some organizations were already quite developed, quite advanced. IOE, by instance, have been already working intensively for already 3 or 4 years with telework policies. But to what extent we were all prepared to have the entire teams working from home and teleworking, that's a different story. We have important practical challenges to assure this business continuity through telework. One, of course, has to do with connectivity. Another one is to identify the best tools available. We have also issues related to performance, productivity. How can you assure a minimum level of productivity and performance in these critical moments? Of course, the issues related to privacy are not minor, and also what people call the right to connect, the right to disconnect. There is a cost element also that have always been there in the telework policies, which is also important to bear in consideration. And of course, all that has to do with health and safety, and more importantly, also the legal framework is at the top of the challenges that good telework policy has. No. Of course, we are not, the aim of this exchange is not to provide all the answers to these questions, but some guidance based on those who have an expertise, those who have already anticipated the problem. And let me just tell you that and I'm going to go quick, I don't want to take much time, but we have with us one of our best partners, one of our best partner companies, which is the Society for Human Resources Management, CHRM. And we have with us the CEO, Johnny Taylor, who is a very vocal and also very developed in terms of expertise manager, who can really help us a lot in terms of anticipating the challenge. We have been receiving questions, requests from all over the world, from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, and the approach, the inputs, the insight that you can provide us are great. We also have with us, and I want also to thank, especially for the short notice, another representative of a partner company, important partner company for IOE, which is Evershed Sutherland. And we have with us Constance Moorhouse. Perhaps Constance is going to focus more on the legal aspects, on the legal framework that telework implies. And also we have with us another important expert on human resources, and specifically on the area of teleworking, working in the Universitat Oberta in Catalonia, who is Eva Rimbaud Gilabert. She also has a business background in her professional experience. And I want to thank all of you also for joining us. Okay, this is really important, and for us the important is not just the exchange, it's also what kind of action we as a business organization and as a companies can undertake for the future. What are the lessons that we have to learn, and also how can we do better on this area. So I don't want to take more time. I would like again to thank all of you, and I want to give now the floor to Johnny Taylor to set in the scene and give us some insights on how can we manage efficiently this specific situation with telework policies. Johnny, you have the floor. Hello? Hello, Johnny?
Hello?
Johnny, can you
Can
hear
you
us?
hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, now yes.
Can you hear
Now,
me? Yes. Good morning.
wonderful.
I was
Wonderful.
speaking and you kept calling my name. I thank you all for having me here. I apologize for the technical glitch here. Again, greetings from the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM. I'm located here in Washington, D.C., the United States official capital. And you can imagine what this has done for us. It has been a whirlwind, and so I want to spend the next 15 minutes providing you some information, the latest information that we have as it applies to the whole idea, the concept of telework, which has been called remote working, which has been called work from home, different phrases, and frankly, there are reasons that different organizations opt for different terms. There was literally a debate over the use of the term remote work because they felt that it was a loaded, if that means anything, a loaded term in that it suggested that people who did so were not a part of the team. So I like your use of the term telework because that totally 100% describes the work. But let me give you the setting for the information that I want to share with you today. We have a knowledge development team of about 30 full-time researchers. These are individuals with PhDs. Many of them are statisticians. Some are IO psychologists and general researchers, people who study human behavior and work. It is led by a colleague of mine, Dr. Alexander Alonso, and he manages this team. We conduct surveys all year long. Many of them are global in context, so we speak with companies, given that we have 300,000 members in 165 countries. We will oftentimes have our surveys will be global in their perspective. But for this purpose, what we're going to do is speak with you about our findings about COVID-19 in the United States only. So just want to clarify that the information that I'm going to share with you with respect to SHRM research that's been recently conducted is focused on the United States only, and you can take the learnings from there and decide if they're applicable in your environment. So I'd like to set the tone with some of our early findings. One of the things that surprised us most in our finding is that we conducted a pulse survey, the last of which was last week, and found that over 1/4, so 27% of American workers say they have received no information from their workplace about plans related to the coronavirus. That number surprised me, and I think all of us would be surprised because you would assume that every company has taken the lead and has spoken with its employees about what COVID-19 means to them, to their company, and to their employment. What we forget too often, and most of us work or have worked in very large organizations, large employers with sophisticated HR practices, is that at least 60, almost 70% of the companies in America are SMEs, or what we call small and medium-sized enterprises. And so you have some very small businesses with 10, 12, 30 employees, and in fact, they don't have any human resources. They don't have full-time or even part-time HR professionals to help guide them through this process. And you can think, for example, on the construction industry. We have a number of construction companies who have just continued business as usual because they know that now that we are teleworking full-time, they actually have full-time access to the buildings. So their employees are going to work every day doing their work on a work site, and this doesn't impact them at all. Their kids may be out of school, their spouse may not be working, but specifically hearing from their employer, it may be business as usual. So while this number feels high, we should keep that in mind as, and again, a very surprise finding for us. The second finding, nearly 72% of the workforce, so 3 in 4 people now in the United States, is working from home. Many of them are working from home fully. When individuals have organizations or parts of organizations where they cannot do it fully, they are on partial. They will go in on a modified work schedule. We're seeing a bit of that. And even for those people who cannot, you literally cannot shut the business down, they're practicing social distancing in the workplace, ensuring that there's space between them and other employees. Bank of America, for example, our largest U.S. bank, for many of its employees, still has them coming to work, but they've broken them into shifts. And so some people work remotely. A half of their population will work remotely Monday through Wednesday, next in the morning, and then the second half will come in the afternoon. So there are all sorts of versions of working from home, from full-time to part-time to periodic and episodic. 1 in 5 workers believe they will face extreme financial hardship or negative consequences if the crisis persists. This is the most significant finding. Even with telework, what we are hearing from employees is that when this is over, they understand that there will be a new norm. And when major employers have announced layoffs, significant layoffs already, this is creating a level of angst, a level of stress with current employees because they believe that it's a matter of time before this COVID will directly impact them. I actually had one of our employees now a week ago, notwithstanding the fact that SHRM is a very healthy organization. We have quite the reserve, we have quite significant financial reserves, and I've been speaking with our employees twice a week, giving them an update. An employee wrote me at 12:30 in the morning, not a direct report, 3 or 4 levels deep into the organization, and said what is keeping him up at night is the prospect that he will lose his job because of COVID-19. So while we are focused on the physical impacts of COVID-19, I don't know that we fully are appreciating the emotional and mental stress of COVID-19 on our employees. And I'm going to tie this in later, but telework adds a different level and a nuanced level of stress to those very employees. If you can go to work and talk through the stress, there's a relief that occurs. We are now seeing people, many of whom are solo, they are single. So when they are sitting in their apartments for 24 hours a day, unable to go out to a restaurant, unable to go to a gym, all they do is sit in and listen to the 24/7 news that tells them every time somewhere on the globe another person dies or is diagnosed with COVID-19, telework is beginning to take its toll on the emotional well-being and the mental well-being of your employees. So we will talk about that. And again, even the people who are not in the target group in terms of being physically at risk are now thinking about the financial aspects of this, and it's taking its toll. One other interesting piece of data that we've gathered from our research is that nearly 6 in 10 American workers cannot and are not able to meet their basic financial needs without pay for 1 month or longer. So again, this is more of that point, but you're talking about 60% of the population says if this lasts more than a month, this will have a significant impact on my financial well-being. So emotional well-being, physical well-being, and now my financial well-being, which is, again, one of the pressure points for SHRM. We have a significant, about 16 or so full-time lobbyists who are working with the federal government and with state governments to extend unemployment leave. I know in many other parts of the world you've always had paid leave, but paid leave is not a requirement under federal law in the United States. So we have a different set of challenges. 4 other findings that stood out. Over half of small businesses estimate that they will lose 10 to 30% of their revenue as a result of the coronavirus epidemic. That again adds to the level of stress, not just for the employees, but for the employer, particularly in the small business context. 1 in 5 small business operators expect that their loss will be greater than 30%. So again, between 10% and 30% say there's going to be a significant impact. About half of businesses say there'll be a significant impact, and that is 10 to 30%. But an additional 20% believe this is going to expect that this will impact their businesses even more. And here is a data point that really is shocking and jarring in some ways, is that 4% expect total loss and closure of their business. We have seen it, particularly in the restaurant business. Small and medium-sized retailers are now really beginning to question whether or not they will survive this. Service-type businesses expect to lose the most, not surprisingly. Hotels, right here in the Washington, D.C. area, Marriott Corporation is based here. Their CEO, who himself is struggling through a health crisis. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in advance of COVID-19. And through this process, because people are globally shutting hotels down, he has now taken himself and his chairman of the board agreed not to take a salary. They've cut the salaries by 50% of the executive team, and then they've begun major furloughs around in their corporate office. So many of the properties have already closed and furloughed employees until this thing is under control. But now it's beginning to affect them in their major corporate office, and that again is creating some stress. The last finding in our research is, despite the focus on remote work as a reaction to the coronavirus pandemic, less than 1/3 of small businesses can operate remotely. And that has everything to do with access to computers and laptops and sophisticated systems, and as well with the question about whether or not their employees actually have Wi-Fi. So it's not enough. And I've talked with an employer recently who said, I can afford to send all of my employees home with a computer. I did not realize how many of my employees did not have Wi-Fi at home. And so that has created a different set of issues, is having the physical equipment, but then the different and perhaps more complicated question is whether or not an employer is going to subsidize Wi-Fi coverage. These are the issues that we are finding that are showing up in the SHRM research that's being conducted. Again, we have always done this research typically once a month because of COVID-19, once a quarter, but COVID-19 research, we are having constant pulse surveys and gathering this data from the American workforce. So with that backdrop, and that was very important to understand what's happening in the minds of our employees, I'd like to take you through quickly some of our thinking, SHRM's national study on the changing workforce and how COVID has impacted. Teleworking isn't new to us, and as it is likely not new to everyone on this call. About 43% of U.S. workers have already worked remotely in some capacity, and a little over half of U.S. jobs, or about 55%, could allow for telecommuting at least on a part-time basis. We've used it for women who go out on maternity leave, for older workers who are providing for their employees who have to provide for elderly parents for whom they must provide care. We provided telework under a number of circumstances. So this isn't new. What is new is that this is forced total telework. That's the difference, is forced total telework. It's one thing when you're doing this because you make the request of an employer to accommodate you, a very different thing when you're being forced to do it and everyone is working remotely. Major organizations with significant investments in telework and flexible work arrangements were better prepared. No surprise, but even those organizations have said this is more complicated than we thought. None of us contemplated the need for us to have human beings interact with human beings, but they are serving as role models. And what we do is when we hear from our small and medium-sized enterprise members, we ask them and refer them to larger companies who have experience here, because they can help prepare them with knowledge type, with information regarding how to manage this situation. And again, even the large organizations have never been in a forced total telework situation, so there are limits on what they can do. One area of concern is talent acquisition. We have not stopped recruiting. In fact, we had if you don't know, we had 3.5% unemployment, record low unemployment in the United States. And so most companies and talent acquisition teams are actually using this as a breather to catch up. They had significant backlogs of open positions, vacant positions, and so this is an opportunity to focus. I did an interview recently for the Wall Street Journal and spoke to this very issue, LinkedIn, and spoke to this very issue. This is an opportunity for talent acquisition professionals to speak to employees that they hadn't just frankly didn't have enough time to get to. They were busy trying to schedule around people's work schedules. If you were pursuing a candidate who was currently employed, then you had to work around his or her schedule. Well, fortunately, and this is an upside, is that person is essentially available at any time because of telework. And so people are using this opportunity, using virtual recruiting tools to continue their work. We have a number of partners, one of whom is a company called HireVue that I'm sure you're familiar with, and they have seen video interviewing triple, extremely high usage, and it's a wonderful thing for all of us because we, especially in the United States with the ultra low unemployment environment, have the opportunity to play catch up a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about the key considerations moving forward, and then I'll pause and let my colleagues from Eversheds and the university speak to it. The number one issue that lies ahead is trying to capture and fully understand the potential long-term economic hardship and the ability to find capital. In the U.S., the federal government, our Department of the Treasury, and this is happening across the globe, is relaxing financial standards so that we can push capital into major corporations and all corporations. We're right now working on a small business stimulus package as well to help the organizations through this. But the individual impacts, the long-term economic hardships that is now hoisted upon our employees are far more significant than any of us can begin to imagine. While we are studying what has happened in China, now that China has come back on board and is coming back on board, we know that at least in the U.S., this will be bumpy for a while. Employers will open again, and some of them will have continued business, but the impact on our employee population is significant. Not just the physical but the emotional and the financial impacts. The second thing that most of our businesses have learned is that we've got to think differently in our business continuity plans about infectious diseases. We'd all seen the movies about outbreak and all of the, Hollywood's, worst case scenarios, and we all thought it could never happen. Well, in fact, it's now happening. We have focused on our IT and technology systems, and we wanted to ensure that they were secure, and we wanted to make sure that the physical workplace was secure from acts of violence in the workplace. But few of, if any, of us thought about infectious disease and how that would impact our business continuity. I can tell you, SHRM hosts several conferences a year. One of our conferences has 22,000 people. We convene 22,000 people. That generates roughly $40 million. That conference alone, top line revenue, is $40 million. Well, frankly, luckily, we thought about that, and we were able to ensure that event, ensure the revenue as well as the expenses side. But there are a number of organizations that didn't think about that, had not fully appreciated it, and they didn't specifically include infectious disease or communicable diseases riders to their insurance policies. So yes, they had an insurance policy for an earthquake, for a hurricane, for a natural disaster, but none thought about incorporating infectious disease riders into their business loss policies. The third thing, though, is that organizations, and specifically HR, will need to be stewards of health, continuity, and wellness as the crisis persists. This is a great opportunity. I took an interview from Reuters recently and spoke to this very, very issue, and that is what this means for the HR profession. For those of us who have been engaged in this work and representing HR professionals around the globe for decades, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to disabuse business leaders. I got some noise there. Yeah, this is an opportunity to disabuse business leaders of this notion that HR is a non-essential, non-critical function. In fact, we are now seeing in a knowledge-based economy that HR matters more than ever now. And as we get through this crisis, the ideas of physical health, emotional health, financial health of our employees and their overall wellness is going to be critical, and this is going to be strictly the domain of HR. Last but not least, and this is a really important point, is nearly 15% of organizations have already stated their intent to permanently implement the new realities, the new norm of operating in the future post-COVID. We know that that will include some version of telework. We know that companies are going to look at productivity differently and try to determine perhaps we don't need to bring as many employees back into a physical workplace. In the past, there have been major assumptions about what types of work could be done remotely. Well, we're going to test that. We're going to test all of those theories now for the next several months, we know, and as a result, there will be a new norm that may ultimately work well for employers. I've already spoken to some employers who are saying, I don't think I need the same amount of square footage when this is done because I know now that those employees can work remotely. I do want to say this and then turn this over. There are some downsides, though, to telework, and we at SHRM are beginning to study them. Some of them I've alluded to already. Every employee does not like to work remotely. And so the idea of isolating employees at home, really, we need to fully appreciate the negative impact on employee morale and ultimately employee retention. We're doing some studies now to break out how this is perceived, teleworking, from different age groups. We know that millennials, we have a perception that millennials, for example, love the idea of telework. What I can tell you is the early research tells us that millennials like flexibility. They do not want 100% telework because they are social creatures, as we all were in our early 20s and 30s, and this is their opportunity to meet and interact with other employees, and that's who they spend their time with. So they can't develop meaningful relationships friendships, that is, with their colleagues if they are working remotely. And so, even the local Starbucks and the coffee shops, now you can get your coffee, but you must take it and go. You can't sit around. And so this notion, I've talked with a number of them, millennials and increasingly Generation Z, who say, we didn't want total work from home. We want to come into the workplace. And so this idea that employers are going to start thinking differently about this and decide that none of us need to come into a downtown center because of the cost of real estate is something that they are very concerned about as being an unintended negative consequences that we will learn too well, that we can get away with allowing people to work remotely via this telework model. So those are our current findings. If you want more information, I've left on the last slide. You can go to sherm.co/health safety or sherm.org as well. And we have stood up a full site, full hub page of information, and encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions. I can always be reached personally at johnny.taylor, that is JOHNNY.Taylor, TAYLOR, at sherm.org. And I'll make sure that myself or Dr. Alonzo, our Chief Knowledge Officer, responds to you with the latest information that we have.
Johnny, has been very impressive. I mean, thank you so much. I think that the data analysis that you have provided us are quite comprehensive, I would say, of the situation of the USA, but also how to deal from a human resources perspective after the coronavirus crisis. I just want to highlight some of the points that you have said. I mean, the data of 1/3 of SMEs that cannot cannot operate remotely. The qualitative element of this forced telework situation, forced and total telework situation. Also, there is an important element of training, virtual training, which now it's taken as a breath to catch up. Also, the video interviews. I have to say that last week we had another exchange, and our Chinese representative from business in China are talking now about scenario post-coronavirus 19 situation in which they see some important challenges even on the 70% of workers that have resumed work and that have some concerns in relation with diseases, that have some concerns in relation with the mentality also on how to resume work. I mean, that's also what you referred regarding the future of telework itself. I want to encourage everybody to raise questions, also using the chat that we have. In fact, we already have a question, but I want to wait perhaps until we finish the 3 intervention. Please, I also want to ask you to remain muted. That's also important in order to have a good quality of sound. And I would like now to give the floor to Constance from Evershed. Please, Constance, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and good afternoon and good morning to all of you. You can see my name and face on the screen there. My name is Constance Morehouse, and I'm a dual qualified German and English partner in the employment team at global law firm Evershed Sutherland, based in the UK, where I lead our International Employment Council team. And everything that I've heard from Johnny so far very much reflects the reality that we've been living through recently, especially the fears and concerns and the worries about businesses. So in a way, it's quite nice that today I'm not talking about how to lay off people and what government supports are available in various jurisdictions, but about the still challenging, but hopefully slightly more positive side of people being able to work remotely and thereby at least keeping their jobs. So today I'm looking at the legal aspects that need to be considered when putting in place home working. And whilst I'm an employment lawyer, you will see on the next slide that there are quite a few other areas that will need to be considered as well when you do set up home working. So there's one thing is the employment contract. How does that need to be adapted? Health and safety. How do you make sure that people are safe in their home office? But then also things around data protection. Roberto briefly touched on that in his introduction. And then especially what we have found increasingly happening as well, people wanting to then homework across a border, people who might be saying, well, whilst I'm normally based in country A, actually, if I have to work from home, can I please go to what is my original home country, country B, and work from there? And then you see quite challenging tax, social security, and immigration questions arising as well. So I'll work through those different areas. So starting with the contract on the next slide, the first question, of course, is place of work. You're changing the place of work if you are suddenly requiring people to work from home. And Johnny already explained that this is a rather unusual situation, because normally we have either a place of work from home for some or all of the time already agreed in the employment contract from the outset, or it is a question of the employee asking for this kind of flexibility to maybe be more easily able to deal with caring obligations. And now we've got the complete opposite scenario, where it is employers en masse basically telling employees to work from home. The legal starting point is really that in the absence of a contractual right to require employees working from home, technically doing so would be a breach of contract. And there's no consistency as to whether in such exceptional circumstances such breach would be justified. But now, having to sort of stay a bit realistic, bearing in mind that governments are telling people to stay at home and telling businesses to send people home, I can't really imagine that in any country, if an employee tried to bring a breach of contract claim, the courts would have any sympathy with such a claim in the current circumstances. In fact, there's some countries that have actually passed specific legislation for this, and not surprisingly, Italy has done so, Italy being the country that was first hit in Europe by the coronavirus and has had the strongest impact. And they introduced smart working provisions, which basically means that whether or not the employment contract or a collective bargaining agreement provides for the ability to make people work from home, that is possible now. I think one of the things that we will see going forward is that after this experience, maybe more employers will think about, should this be a standard clause in the contract that actually in certain circumstances the employer could require employees to work from home. We obviously always learn from experience, and maybe this experience will turn this into an issue that we will include as a standard. One key factor for successful home working is obviously having the right equipment, and Johnny already mentioned the fact that, you know, companies might be able to give people laptops, but what if they don't have Wi-Fi connection at home? From a legal perspective, it is also important to regulate the issue of equipment and costs. So it's not enough just to say to somebody, here's the laptop, but you have to think about what other equipment might be needed. Is the infrastructure at home sufficient? Even if it's there, who pays for what? In some countries, if you don't expressly regulate that, the employees might have a claim on an implied contract basis for a share of the costs of their room, for the costs of heating and the costs of lighting. So all of that should be thought through and clearly regulated, either in the contract or in a home working policy. Likewise with health and safety. So across the board in all jurisdictions, an employer has a duty of care to its employees and must ensure a safe place of work. And that doesn't cease to apply just because somebody is then working from home. So employers are under an obligation to carry out a risk assessment in respect of the home working, the teleworking, and to take appropriate measures to deal with any risks they identify. Especially in the current situation, it's obviously not practical for an employer to actually visit the employee's home office to make such an assessment. But nevertheless, the employer must take reasonable steps to carry out such an assessment. So doing a sort of broader and general assessment of what types of risks can arise in a home office is necessary. And the sort of risks that typically need to be addressed are, the first one, stress. Johnny already mentioned that quite clearly. There is the fact of, the very different working environment, not having colleagues to be able to exchange with, but also the lack of boundaries between home and work, which can cause additional stress to employees, and employers need to think about how they can address that. The equipment itself, is it safe to use? Is the workstation set up sufficiently? So at least giving employees guidance as to how they should set up their home working place is important. And then what if something did happen, if some accident did happen, how do you ensure that you still get accident reporting going? So informing employees that even though they're remote from their normal place of work, they still need to alert the employer of things, of accidents happening. That leads the topic of accident can also sort of lead on to the topic of insurance. There's on the one hand the insurance for equipment, for example, that the employer provides to the employee. Is that insured when it's taken out of the office? If not, does the employer extend its insurance? Does the employee have to take out some insurance for using his or her home as effectively temporary business premises? And if so, who pays for that? So all those issues need to be checked with relevant insurance providers, and if there are additional costs, that needs to be regulated and agreed. The next point I want to talk about is working hours, working time. That is in a way a subset of health and safety, because working time legislation is basically health and safety related legislation to ensure that employees don't work excessive hours and thereby cause themselves illness. In the present situation, it's basically a sort of twofold interest. On the one hand, employers will want to know that employees, even though they're out of sight, out of mind in many ways, that they're still doing their contracted hours. On the other hand, there's also, certainly in Europe, a requirement for employers to keep working time records and being able to show that it complies with working time laws, and that people to take their breaks during the working days and between working days. That in practice is very difficult when an employee is not in an office and not visible. So again, explaining to the employee what the framework is, explaining that they are responsible for ensuring that they take necessary breaks is quite important. And as I said, conversely, the employer would also want to know that despite not having oversight directly of the employee, they're still doing the time that they're meant to be doing. It's one thing in an industry like mine where we are ruled by the clock and have to record our life in 6-minute units, but in most jobs that is not the case. So how will employers be able to sort of still see that everyone is pulling their weight? So that's a challenge, and I think with sort of guidance and policies is something that could be regulated. And then the final point on this slide, confidentiality and data security. Obviously, by letting things get out of the employer's premises, there is a greater risk of breaches of data security and confidentiality. So it's important to explain to employees how they need to safeguard whatever they take into their home office, whether that is the laptop or hard copy documents, from access by unauthorized third parties, people in their household, for example, ensuring that they know that whenever you leave your laptop, you should actually lock the screen and not just have it sitting there open, for example. So again, that requires a particular adaptation to the circumstances of teleworking. Those are the things that apply in any scenario. Now, on the next slide, I want to cover some of the issues that are more issues where you actually then get into the realms of cross-border teleworking. And I think it's, I mean, you might find it surprising how often that arises, but I think because modern technology makes it so easy to work anywhere in the world. You could be sitting on a beach in India and still be, having your calls and your meetings with somebody sitting in the US, in the UK, or somewhere else. And I found even before this particular crisis that I have increasing numbers of clients who have individuals who, at their own request, are actually working from home from another country, and that actually raises some tricky issues. So the first one, and that's quite an important one for the employer, is tax. Now, in a normal home working scenario where the home is in the same country as the workplace, the only tax issues that arise tend to be whether the employee can claim certain things as business-related expenses back from his or her tax. In a cross-border scenario, this becomes a lot more tricky, because suddenly, if you as an employer have somebody sitting in another country doing work for you, the question arises whether that individual creates a permanent establishment for tax purposes for that business, which could then lead to a corporation tax obligation on the employer. So that's obviously a crucial thing to check and to avoid as far as possible. And it would require specific analysis of the circumstances, whether or not an individual creates a permanent establishment. I would have hoped if it's a temporary few weeks working from home in another country during the coronavirus outbreak, then the risk is fairly low. But if it is something that is a bit more long-term, then that is definitely something to look at. And then on the reverse side, of course, the employees' tax situation becomes more complicated when they go to another country. Do they then have to pay income tax in that other country? Do they potentially have to pay income tax in both jurisdictions? And how does the employer operate deductions at source? In which country or countries is there an obligation to operate payroll deduction? The same sort of issue arises in respect of Social Security, as to where the employee has to pay Social Security. Within the EU, for example, and until the end of this year, that still does include the UK due to agreed transition rules. There are EU regulations on the applicable Social Security regime, and their starting point is that Social Security is paid where the work is done. So if an employee permanently works from home in another member state than the one where the employer's business is based, they would have to pay Social Security in the country where their home office is located. And this is also the case if they only partly work from home and partly at the employer's premises, provided they carry out a substantial amount of activity in their home office. A substantial amount means, in this case, more than 25% of their working time. So this means the employer cannot simply keep such cross-border home workers in its standard payroll as if they worked in the office. Then the question of immigration may also need to be considered when you have this cross-border scenario. So in the UK, for example, we have a system where an employer has to act as a sponsor and has quite significant reporting obligations regarding any migrant worker they do sponsor. And the change of place of work is something that may trigger a reporting obligation. But in a cross-border home working scenario, this raises much more significant questions, namely whether the employee actually has the legal right to work in the country where their home office is based. With freedom of movement within the EU, we've become quite used to this not being an issue, but obviously as soon as the country involved is outside the EU, and that will mean the UK from the 1st of January next year, then this could potentially create serious issues. So imagine a UK citizen employed by a German employer who, at his own request, works alternate weeks at the German employer's office in Frankfurt and then from his girlfriend's home in the Netherlands. Could, from the 1st of January next year, this UK citizen work in either of those countries as he or she does at the moment. So I'm not an immigration expert, but I can see this throwing up tricky questions. And then finally, wherever you have a cross-border scenario, that does throw up the question of which law actually applies. And again, within the EU, we have harmonized law in respect of conflict of law rules. And they basically say that the mandatory rules of the law of the country where your habitual place of work is cannot be overridden by a choice of law. So if somebody long-term move to a home working arrangement with the home from which they work being in another country, that would typically mean their habitual place of work is then in another country to the employer's business, and the mandatory employment law rules of that country, to the extent they're more beneficial for the employee, would override any chosen law, which would typically be the law of the place of the employer. So that again then becomes quite a sort of messy and complex scenario. As I said, the COVID-19 is hopefully a rather temporary scenario, but I can envisage that, as Johnny indicated, there will be changes longer term as to how people operate, and these kinds of remote working arrangements are likely to become more and more common as they've now been stress tested quite extremely. So bear that in mind for the future if you are considering allowing people to work, in particular cross-border from home, that raises not only employment issues, but those additional tax, social security, immigration, and conflict of law issues as well. So that's really a very quick gallop through the legal issues to consider. I hope it has given you some food for thoughts, and I'm happy to pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Constance. He has been also very, very rich, very comprehensive. I mean, all the issues related to tax, social security, immigration, applicable law, those issues, at least in my organization as a manager, because we have also many people teleworking, we have already raised that, and we try also to navigate different jurisdictions. And I can assure you that it's not easy. It's not easy because we have more and more people working abroad. It's not just a question of teleworking at home. It's very often working abroad. Well, it's not the case now because that's a specific situation, but that's also coming. To some extent, we have to recognize that the regulations that we have are local and national regulations, and sometimes, well, we have to see how we overcome the challenging situation of teleworking, helping people to work not just in your jurisdiction, but in another jurisdiction. Anyway, we have already several questions. I want to optimize the time so that we'll bring all these questions at the end. So Eva, thank you again for joining us. Also again for the short notice. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me here, and I'm glad to talk to you about the human resources point of view to implement this emergency telework we are having now. And I want to use this idea of emergency telework because this is not telework as usual, and it has it's a special situation, and special considerations have to be given to the well-being of employees more than as usual we should. So the contents of my presentation will be a brief introduction, and I want to keep a double focus throughout all my presentation. I want to focus on, let's say, productivity issues, how to organize, how to manage so that work gets done, but also to focus on well-being, meaning social or psychosocial aspects of work that are always relevant, but in an emergency situation are even more relevant. Then I'll just give some ideas of what can be done at company level, some ideas for team managers, and very briefly I'll talk about what individual employees can do. So turning to the first idea, this is an idea that will flow in my whole presentation. Sometimes we can find human resources department that focus on results and productivity, and this is very important. But in a situation like this, when there's so strong uncertainty, workers are worried about their health, their family's health, their future income, etc. The psychosocial aspects are really, really important. And those are not two separate focuses. They are not competing amongst each other, because if psychosocial issues are not well managed and taken into account, productivity will not be possible. So as you will see, I will blend both focuses in the three levels of analysis I will follow. So just you can keep this in mind. At the company level, there are some, I'm going to give advice so about what should a company do. Most of this advice comes from research and from best practices. And there are some basics that any company should cover. First is having a clear mindset. This is not an experiment. We are not in the situation of saying this is an experiment and we'll see how telework goes. No, because an experiment is performed in a situation when we can compare. Some people are working, let's say, normally, other people are working in a telework setting, and we compare results. Now, this telework is not an experiment. This telework is forced telework, as Tony said clearly, full-time telework, not by choice. Sometimes companies are not prepared. They don't have the technology, they don't have the expertise. So this is not telework as usual. This is emergency telework. And what will this emergency telework is keep companies going. It will alleviate, it will ameliorate a tough situation, both for companies and for telework or workers. But it's not the moment to be calculating if the performance has improved or performance has decreased due to telework. Okay, so this just is a question of mindset. Then the basics, of course, include technology, and we won't go into there, but you have to find a way to have the right technology, or not the right technology, the enough technology, just the bare minimum to get work done. And you will improve in the future, but now just get the lowest level of technology you know you need to get work done from home. Then decide, the second question would be decide who can work from home. And I would advise to err on the side of allowing telework more often than not, because maybe soon everybody who can telework will have to, or so that's what's happening in many countries. So decide which persons can telework, and even though a person have several different tasks which are not all of them can be performed from the distance, just decide which ones can be performed from the distance, so that that time can be done from home and not from the company. Then decide if you will have to have some special policies for caregivers or employees that have sick relatives. I know this is not from a legal point of view, which has been already covered, but from a, let's say, humane point of view, remember this situation will finish, and these kind of decisions about special situations are a strong are strong messages for employees. They will remember, and their fidelity, their loyalty to the company will have a lot to do with what has been decided for special situations. The next decision is very relevant, is decide about communication channels. What kind of communication channels will the company use to communicate with all the employees, between team members, one-to-one? You can choose from many tools that are available. Just this has to be decided from the first moment. And when these decisions have been made, communicate the policies, the tools, when to use what, and of course give advice to the employees how to work from home. Talk about physical and psychological health, and this is very important. Just explain to employees that their health is important, not only physically, and that's why they are teleworking, to avoid getting infected, but their psychological health. Advice about disconnecting, advice about unwinding, and of course communicate support and calm from the point of view of the company. The work is and your company as an employee is a very important reference point in your life, and getting the sense that the company is giving support to its employees will improve commitment, and will improve well-being, and therefore quality of work in employees. So that should be followed or accompanied by explicit communication from top management, which is the voice of the company. And this communication has to create a social support, a supportive context. A supportive context depends on three main elements. The first one is information. Top management has to inform about the crisis, the causes, the consequences, the impact on the company, and what's being done about this impact. Then has to convey a sense of safety, of calmness, of self and community efficacy, the belief that we can overcome this, and hope and connectedness. And finally, it's important to foster social acknowledgement, meaning it's important to reassure people that if they are displaying stress reactions, that's normal. Recognize that people are stressed and that's not business as usual, and that some weird things can happen. And finally, this is not business as usual. Priorities have to be established and communicated. And this has to go all over the company, from top management to each team manager. So to the next slide. Just when you design all the things regarding how are we going to work remotely, particularly the tools and communication tools, keep in mind that according to research, remote work reduces knowledge sharing. And because there are not unexpected meetings, you cannot find people at the water cooler or whatever. So that normally can result in reduced innovation. So if you are mindful of that, you can prepare other communication tools to increase these different types of knowledge sharing. Informal knowledge sharing, for example, creating virtual water cooler, virtual coffee breaks, etc., or creating more formal tools for collaborative work. And finally, of course, training both for managers and employees would be very important to have a successful telework experience, and always be open to initiative from employees so that you can refine remote work policies according to their needs, their problems, and other issues that they find out. Now, changing the level to managers. Team managers first have to convince themselves that it's possible to give up physical control of employees without losing actual control. And that's been that's backed by research, but also they have to experience it to believe it, of course. And that may be difficult for managers who are used to manage by walking around. But and it's even more difficult because in order for telework to really work, employees need autonomy, and managers who are very keen on physical direct site control may not be so keen on giving enough autonomy. But research shows that monitoring too closely can have a negative effect on productivity and on adaptability and on work quality. So managers have to be ready to give enough autonomy to employees. Otherwise, telework won't work. Micromanaging doesn't work when we have teleworkers. But however, keep in mind that not all employees want autonomy. There are stark differences between different persons. So team managers have to be able to personalize the level of autonomy they give to their collaborators. Another issue is that task interdependence makes teleworking teleworking makes difficult to perform tasks that are very interdependent, when the final output depends on many people getting to an agreement and working together in a complex way. Teleworking makes that more difficult. So managers maybe should try to, at the beginning at least, reduce task interdependence and make very clear who does what, or maybe structure that interdependence and arrange meetings, communication channels, etc., that can make that interdependence clearer for everybody. Following the idea of paying attention to psychosocial issues, it's very important that managers especially promote social support. They can make the difficult adaptation to emergency telework easier, just recognizing the possible difficulties, asking workers about how are they doing, how their families are doing, and recognizing that it may be difficult. And of course, the same as I was saying before, establishing and communicating priorities will make everything easier, because the goals that employees have to follow will be clearer, and because it will reinforce trust, which is a very, very relevant element in telework. On the one hand, we have autonomy, and the other hand, we have trust. It's very important to establish a balanced, what we call psychological contract between the manager or the employer and the employee, a clear set of expectations that is balanced. I don't expect too much from you, and you are not expecting too much from me either. Just that the relation is fair for all the parts. It can be even more important than clearly defined deliverables. And we can get it through frequent communication, not only about work, but about personal life, difficulties. What I was saying about social support comes handy here. And this all comes together in very material forms sometimes, which, for example, can be documenting about decisions, responsibilities, and results. If everything is clearly documented and it's open and available for all the employees, trust will be reinforced, priorities will be clear, and even workers will be able to work more autonomously. And at the same time, managers have to be willing to experiment, to learn, and adapt their practices of telework. And finally, just very briefly, yes, just change, yes. Turning to individual employees, the human resources departments have to explain to individual employees, have to help individual employees to get the basics of telework. There's a lot of information about that in the internet, so I won't go deep here. But explain about which tools are we going to use, when are we going to use them, help employees establish an adequate place to telework. It may not be perfect in these times of emergency telework, but just try to keep it good enough, and explain to employees how to get into the mood of teleworking. So establishing routines before, during, and after telework. And teleworkers also need to accept that this may be difficult, and may be difficult for each teleworker and for all the rest. So we should try to find the way to help employees understand others. It's very, very different to be teleworking when you have a whole family at home, your children don't have school, and you have your full-time work through telework, or when you are alone at your home and you have not another thing to do than working. And these very different situations need common understanding. Also, it's important to explain to employees how to take care of themselves, how to disconnect, and how to unwind, and to ask them to communicate intentionally about what are they doing, what are they working about, what problems are they finding, and what results are they getting also. And this is my whole presentation. It's important, just as a reminder, focus both on productivity and on well-being, and this flow of double focus should go along the three levels: company-wide, teams and managers, and individual employees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. I think also has been also very, very illustrative of how we can do better. I would like just to stress one of the points that you have made: autonomy goes hand in hand with the telework. I mean, that's essential. Also, the element of trust, but the element also well planifying, having priorities and a good communication level. I mean, what we see now is many teams teleconnecting every day just to have even the virtual view of each other as something essential, isn't it? And that also can help also for the future, and also in order to strengthen the productivity that we are needing more and more in our companies and in our organizations. There are several messages and several questions. I would ask perhaps Linda Cronjon, who referred to human resources policies and referred to the skills and tools to support the company and its employees to navigate the new reality. I don't know if you want Linda to elaborate more on that, or we leave it like that.
Yeah, hi, Roberto. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Well, I think I did already get a response back via the chat on my question. But I think it was a great presentations, all three of them, and I think it's very illustrative about what's happening. And I think the key message is we need to take care about well-being of people, and that requires also at this point in time different skill set from HR, who are currently in crisis mode and are also trying to adapt very fast to gain the new skills. So that was where my question came from. What is that we can do to equip the HR persons within companies to deal best with this crisis, because they are crucial. I hope this clarifies. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Johnny. May I take a shot at that one?
Please, Johnny. Please, Johnny.
Yeah, I think the point, and thank you so much, Linda, for raising that question, because too often we don't think about what we need to do to support HR professionals during this period of time. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us to all take back to our businesses. I've described HR people at this point as the equivalent of first responders. If you were to think about what we would do if there were a natural disaster, police officers, firefighters, etc. But HR people are not only having to deal with all of this change, from layoffs to furloughs to taking people into forced and total work from home, while at the same time balancing their own personal challenges. They have children who will no longer be in school, and so they've got to provide for them while being on 24/7. And so one thing that I think it's important for us to do, and it may sound a little soft, if you will, here, is we have got to be really mindful of the stress level that HR practitioners are under right now, because to your point, it's always been a difficult job, but it's an incredibly difficult job now, and will be for the foreseeable future, because there won't be a magic flag that says coronavirus is done. We will now have a very different world that we live in. So thank you for raising that question and the importance of taking care of HR professionals, giving them, one of the things that we encourage is access to mental health counselors during this period of time, ensuring that HR professionals take breaks, that we staff it in such a way where the director or the manager of HR has a period of time where he or she takes time away from answering calls, solving problems. Just specific examples of what we should do.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes we forget that in order to set up a policy, a human resources policy on telework, you need all the strategy, or all the communication, or planning, and the human resources persons are the ones suffering more when you have to do it like we had to do it during this period. There is also a legal question from Tito de Cuba, our friend in Aruba. Do you want to elaborate it, or I read it, Tito?
Thanks, Roberto. Yes, look, it has been mentioned about forced teleworking situation. So actually, we are forcing the employee to do something that it's not part of his or her let's say working conditions. We tell them, instead of working here at the office, you have to work at home. But legally, it's very challenging here in Aruba, because the law says that unilaterally you cannot modify a labor agreement or the conditions of the labor agreement. So unless there is a substantial interest. And, the courts doesn't easily accept, just, saying, look, there is an economic reason for us to do that. So, I was wondering if any one of us taking part in this webinar had other experiences and can provide arguments for us to use if we end in one moment in such a situation. Thank you.
It's Constance here. Maybe I should make a brief comment since I commented on that during my presentation. I mean, obviously, it depends on whatever jurisdiction you're in, what the exact legal arguments would be. I think in this particular, you're absolutely right that in the absence of this being in the contract, technically it's a breach of contract for the employer to unilaterally say you're going to be working from home. I do think that certainly in countries where there are lockdowns, like Italy or Spain or in France, I think there would be an argument a little bit along the lines of force majeure. If the government basically says people who can work from home must work from home, it's I would have hoped that a judge would then say, well, that is actually a justification, even in countries, and that's a large number, where it is a recommendation from a sort of public health point of view. Again, I would hope that the courts wouldn't sort of take a literal interpretation here, but it is a completely unprecedented situation. So, I mean, in terms of the discussion with the employee, I think the discussion would sadly have to go along the lines, well, you can either work from home or unfortunately not at all. And if you can't work at all, then we have to consider whether we can actually continue your employment. Now, how that discussion would pan out obviously then again depends massively on which country you're in and what the employment law framework is. But I mean, so far from the clients that I've been speaking to, we've not had particular experiences where employees have pushed back. I think the vast majority of employees do accept that these are exceptional circumstances and are probably glad to have a job rather than have none. But I don't know if other people have different experiences.
No, I think this is a very useful guidance, and at the end of the day, this can be, I believe also with my legal mind, that this can be perfectly taken as a force majeure element. We have also Stephen from Singapore referring to, well, to their experience, and also the fact that you have also this forced exit management, what he calls exit management, meaning people going from home. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Stephen, or not. Perhaps Stephen already left.
Okay, Roberto, thanks for the time. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Basically, I was also trying to respond to Linda's question, and also adding on to the fantastic speakers have been sharing with us is that, yes, definitely, I think times like this, the HR basically under tremendous pressure. They themselves also need to develop new skills, upskills, in order to basically handle things like business continuity plan. This business continuity plan, I fully agree. You're dealing with people, you're dealing with infectious disease. It's not a typical kind of crisis that we can think of. So things like BCP, business continuity plan, how to do it, and even to the extent we are also seeing companies in Singapore, they have no choice but to exit their staff, how to do it more in a pleasant manner, the do's and don'ts as well. So these are the things that we are equipping our HR to learn. We offer training in many forms, in a very small group, or even for that matter, video conferencing as well. So we ourselves are trying to be as innovative as possible, trying to get across the message, trying to upskill people, learn new skills in times like this through many modes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. We have two very specific remarks, one from Farokh in Bangladesh and another one from Chiara in our team, our human resources manager in IOE. And then I would like also to make a reference to the comment and question raised by our friend in South Africa, Yahin. Farouk, if I may say, that we optimize our time, refer to the mandatory for management to provide office equipment, computers, laptops during teleworking, which I think is something that some of you can answer. And Chiara referred to a very specific legal obligation that we have in Switzerland, but I think in other countries, also in Spain, I think, of registering entry and exit time, which is quite challenging when you have to apply by force majeure teleworking policies. I don't know if any of you can answer that, and then we'll go to the last question.
It's Constance again, because they sound to me like legal issues. So in terms of providing office equipment, I mean, in principle, the employer has to provide a safe place to work. And I think that also requires, under health and safety legislation, that also means the equipment to work with. So obviously, again, you know, country by country differences, but I would expect that by and large it's for the employer to provide the equipment that is necessary for employees to carry out their work. I mean, that is one of the key differences to engaging self-employed contractors. So, you know, with the caveat that obviously you'd need to look at specific countries for the specific details of that. I think my expectation would be that by and large, at least the sort of basic equipment for people to carry out their job is really the employer's responsibility. And in terms of working time, I briefly addressed that in my presentation, certainly across Europe, because of working time, the Working Time Directive and the European Court of Justice interpretation of that, employers are obliged to be able to keep records of people's working time. And there are, even in normal circumstances, tricky scenarios of people, you know, field-based employees, etc., as to how you do that. And I think that's just exacerbated in this teleworking scenario. I guess you could sort of have a system where people sort of effectively clock on and notify their line manager, I'm here. The other question is, and that then strays into data protection areas again, or also in some countries in the involvement of Works Council, as to whether you can just take it from the data as to when you see their computer logs onto the system. Now, that obviously would be open to potential manipulation. You know, I could get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, log my computer onto the system, and then go off and have a very leisurely breakfast for the next 2 hours. I think that the reality is you can try and give guidance and internally as to people not exceeding working time limits, but there isn't a clear answer as to how you can really manage that. As I said, even in normal times, I know employers are struggling with this concept of how they actually can track genuine working time, and people more often outside normal office hours, you know, do work on their laptops, on their iPhones, etc. So I think that's a developing area. We just have to see how we best cope with that.
Indeed, and that's why. Sorry.
Can I add just
Yes,
a point
of course.
to
Yes,
this, more from a management point of view? Of course, it's tricky also in normal times to track time, but in this emergency telework situation, I think it's important to not be too focused on schedules, on 9 to 5 or whichever, but to just accept that the work will be done, and employees, if they have to register the time they work, they will with electronic devices or an app. There are apps for that. But the important is not to focus too much on shared schedules, because everyone will have different situations. If you have caregiving responsibilities, maybe you need a longer pause in the middle of the day than a person that's working alone, or maybe you will wake up very early to get your work done early in the morning before the children wake up, or you have to go and take care of your old mother in the evening, so you won't be able to work after 5 while other people will be working more hardly at that time. So schedules are not a good framework in this special situation, and I would advise companies not to focus on them too much.
I totally agree. Even if there's a legal challenge there, in IOE and also in many business organizations, we consider these regulations more and more, outdated, because the concept of time is changing. And as you said, it's much more important that workers and employers have a sense of deconnection also. I mean, they need to also disconnect, and also they need to well manage its time, working time, rather than registering entry and exit, which I think is quite, it's not just quite challenging right now, but also in a normal period of time in organizations like mine, I can assure you that it's very, very challenging. Yagni from South Africa, if I'm not wrong, correct me, you are working in the agricultural sector, and you referred, you raised a question which is perhaps a little bit, which goes beyond the Telework exchange and has to do with insurance systems in the USA. I don't know if Johnny wants to answer that. I mean, how the unemployment insurance system works in practical terms. Is that the question, Yagni?
Thank you so much, Roberto. That is indeed my question. You are correct. I work in the agricultural sector in a lobby group, an influence group. What we've seen here, and this was specifically towards Johnny's presentation, we unfortunately have cases where agricultural workers cannot work remotely. There is just unfortunately absolutely no way. If the production on a farm comes to an end, your workers and seasonal workers unfortunately are in a position where they would have to claim uninsurance if the business is in such a position that it cannot pay. Now, our government has actually intervened quite extensively and brought in additional unemployment insurance benefits and unpaid leave and special leave and so forth, looking at the most vulnerable workers. Now, I must say, for agriculture in our country, we have almost 800,000 employees. And of those, the vast majority are minimum wage earners. It's low skilled work. It's not aspirational work, unfortunately, and it's also not something that can be transported to teleworking. Now, I know that's very peculiar to my sector, but while Johnny was speaking, I just actually wanted to know what was the situation in America in terms of unemployment. If these businesses and small businesses close for a set period of time, is there any relief for workers in your country? Thank you.
Well, thank you for asking that question. And in fact, there is. That's what our lobbyists, as I mentioned, we have about 16 people full-time who sit in Washington, D.C. and in California to try to impact federal and state legislation. So we are currently passing specialized legislation to deal with this crisis, as an experience we have not seen before, as we've all discussed. So it includes a couple of things. One, for those individuals who are in industries where telework is not possible, which we understand, from first responders, individuals in the healthcare, nurses can do some telemedicine, but most of their work must be done in person, for example. And so there are a number of industries where it is simply impossible for an individual to work remotely. And what we're saying is that we have to provide safe workplaces. I'm sure Constance can speak to this. We have to do our best to provide workplaces that are as safe as they can be without guaranteeing safety. And so we have the equivalent of occupational safety standards in a department in the federal government called OSHA that is saying this is what you must do if you are the type of employer who cannot provide telework options. These are the precautions you must take to protect the employees who must come to work. For those employers, though, who, as a result of COVID-19 and the wake effect or the implications, for those who are forced to lay these employees off or to furlough them, we are making special, right now, at the federal level, they're making special exceptions to extend the offering of unemployment insurance payments to those people. Last week, we passed a piece of legislation in the United States that required almost all not totally all, because there are some exceptions for smaller companies, but almost all companies of roughly 500 or more employees to provide paid leave for any individual who's impacted by the COVID-19, either a diagnosis or who is a family member who's been diagnosed with it, so that those people aren't forced to come to work or to make a decision between coming to work or not eating. So we're providing mandatory employer-paid COVID leave, paid leave for those employees. So we're trying to figure it out as these are uncharted waters, and it's easy to say. I'll say this: it would be easy to say we should have legislation requiring all employers provide coverage for their employees. But we know that has a disproportionate impact on small and medium-sized companies. And as we said from our data suggests that 4% of these companies say they will cease to exist anyway, just because of the COVID-19 situation. And if we were to add any government mandates on those employers to provide paid leave or insurance to those employees, that number would go from 4% to some number on an order of magnitude significantly higher.
Johnny, I think that your explanation has been very, very intense in terms of elements, and it's very interesting what's going on in terms of how you really cope with those people that are now without incomes, also working from home, and also how the insurance system also. And I hope that this also helped our friend from South Africa also to answer her question. We have to finish because it's now 3:30. I think that it has been a very, very rich exchange, but as I said at the very beginning, for us, the important thing is not just exchange, it's also to identify actions for IOE to go forward. Of course, we are going to provide some guidance to our members, but also connecting again with all of you. And a special thank also to Johnny, to Constance, and also to Eva for their contribution. It has been really very, very helpful. And we are here also to support you in any thing, in any challenge that you have regarding teleworking and other matters. We are organizing on Wednesday another exchange, important exchange on economic advocacy and how we can cope. What are the measures that really work to avoid or mitigate the employment job losses that we are foreseeing. Thank you to all of you, and have a nice afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are. See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.